I'm Winnie Dowden Wyatt. I want to share with you a story that I have recently had published for Everything a Time in this magazine, the Writer Review. If you would like to contact them, subscribe to their paper, this is where you can find it, in Graham, North Carolina. Okay, I have written this story for two reasons. One is for many of you who have not had the experience of being in an African village, I want to take you there. Now the other reason is that this is a mother story. It matters not if you're a mother in America, North or South, Asia, Europe, or Africa. We're all mothers. I'm a mother of boys, so I know this. There comes a time in your life when that child that you have nurtured through so many things come away from you. And sometimes it's painful. You have given him birth, you have seen his first steps, you have heard his first words, you have seen him grow, you have done so many things with him in a time that was yours. But he will draw away from you, as he must. They will do that in America, in Africa, any other place. Now in Africa, that sometimes happens earlier. When a child leaves his village and goes away to school, he never can absolutely return. So here it is, for everything a time. And I took the title from Ecclesiastes, where it says there's a time to mourn and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to weep and there's a time to dance. So, for everything a time. First we will go through the story beginning with when the child was born. Ezema struggled all night while the first rain slashed at the thatched roof and wind shredded the blowing palm trees. One of the old women built a fire in the middle of the hut, but Ezema, flailing about on the straw hut, felt no need of it. Sweat poured from her body, wet the worn mat, and seeped through the loosely woven grasses. A column of ants, diverted by the driving rains, had made their way into the mud hut and marched toward the panting woman. One old crone flapped at them with a banana leaf, warding them away from her patient. "It's coming now," one old woman said, pulling at Ezema's insides. Oh, the sound came from her throat against her will as Ezema faced the fourth ordeal at borning this worrisome child. "His foot wants to come first," the old woman said quietly, but Ezema heard and her tired body went slack with despair. 3 times already this child had come walking into this room feet first, and those had been desperately hard. The African woman braced herself for the pain that must come. If this child will not stay this time, Ezema wished she might go with it. For another borning of this fleeing child she did not want to face. Then after the rasping cry that came from her throat, she lost consciousness. Consciousness came to her at the slashing of the fierce winds, but there was wailing in the room, thin, weak, complaining, a baby's cry. So he had come again. How long would he stay? Until morning? And then she drifted back off to sleep again. "Do you think he will stay?" one old woman said. "Shh! He may hear you and leave," said another old woman. Again Ezema returned to consciousness and realized that the rain had stopped and the fire had gone out. Her feet were cold and her hands were chilled, as if she'd been washing all night in the river. Ezema shivered in the draught and with great difficulty shifted her cold body on her mat. A whimpering cry came from her left side, and there was a warm spot there. She lifted her right hand and touched the soft fuzziness of newborn hair. He was still here. Her fingers trembled as she stroked at the baby's head. The infant wiggled and emitted soft sucking sounds. He wanted to eat. Esmond drew him to her breast. Never before had this child stayed long enough to take food from her body, but had left soon after each birthing, leaving her breast hard and unrelieved. There were sounds in the village as the people stirred in the damp morning. One woman in the nearby compound complained of her rain-soaked wood she could not get to burn, and another shouted irritably at her whimpering children. Esmond pulled her baby closer. "I will never scream at you if you will stay," she said. So there was a rattling of hoes and cutlasses and the tramping of hard feet on the path as the villagers prepared to go to their farms. A limp cloth was lifted in the doorway, and Esmond's husband, Okonkwo, announced his presence. His sleeping cloth was still around him, and he stood there shyly. "I salute you for my son," he greeted his wife. Esmond looked at the baby to be sure he was sleeping before she whispered, "I think he will stay this time." Okonkwo nodded but ventured no opinion. He believed, as did Esmond, that the baby lying there was the same child to which the mother had given birth before. He stayed only a moment, and as he was leaving, he drew his sleeping cloth from his shoulders and spread it over Esmond's clothed feet. After he had gone, Esmond thought about her husband. Life had shown him no favors. Okonkwo had not been treated with much kindness or pounded yam by his father's other two wives, and after his father died, he had lived first here and first there, making his way welcome with his two working hands. With no inheritance, it was not until he was many years a man that he had gotten enough money to come to her father with her bride price. Okonkwo tilled his farm that morning with great zeal, for very soon his son might be there beside him to help him till his yam. As the baby grew rounder and fuller, they knew he was going to stay, perhaps, and it was time to give him a naming ceremony. Oh, this was a big deal in Africa. Everyone's given a name. That name means something, and it's a big day. So if he was going to stay, well, they were going to do it. So he was several weeks old, and so they had a feast for everybody from villages around, and palm wine and dancing, and it was a good time. And during this time, Esmond carried that baby with her everywhere. There were no strollers, nothing at all. She carried him on her back. When she pounded her yam in a pot like this, which was made from one tree, and it's quite heavy, I can tell you. This is the thing she would have pounded her yam in. He was on her back. She went to wash her clothes. He was on her back, and she would go down to the river to get water, and he loved being on her back, as all children do. It was comfortable. It was a warm place to be. So he was on her back riding all the time. And Okonkwo was just so proud. He at last had a son. He was so almost impossible to say his pride is. Anyway, it was during this naming ceremony that he gave his first laugh. And so she said, "Okay, now I know you'll stay here because you have found laughter here on this compound." So when the festivities were all over, Okonkwo came late to her hut and said, "I salute you for the soup and yam you've prepared." And she said, "Well, I salute you for the friends who have eaten it." And then he said, "I think the newly named Okonkwo will stay." And she nodded. And then he said, "I think you'll be going to your father's compound very soon." And she nodded. "Yes," she said, "but before I go, I will choose a new wife for you. Already I have one in mind." Okonkwo nodded and rose to go. Esmond was a good wife. She would take care to his needs. So Esmond faces a time that all African women in the village would have to face, for the baby that she had would need to be nursed for 2 years. And during this time, she may not produce another child. If she did, deprived of vital nourishment from the firstborn child giving place to the younger one would simply dwindle away, and there'd be nothing for him to eat. And it is a disease, they say, the younger kills the older, because he must nurse for 2 years. So this must not happen to her child. So she must go to her father's compound and stay there for some time until the baby is up and growing. And she'd picked out a wife for her husband, and she didn't even tell him goodbye. She just left. And she knew the wife would be a good one, and so she felt okay. And she carried her belongings in an enamel pan on top of her head and the baby on her back, and she began the 20-mile walk to her father's compound. Well, in the first days, it felt like a festival there at her house, in her old room, and all of her friends after that, and her oldest brother Zeke came with his wide flowing robes because he was a palm wine merchant. He employed a lot of people to climb the palm trees that had the wine. They climbed up with no ladders, nothing, just their feet, and they would cut the top of the wine, the palm thing off, and when the juice fermented, it would come off. They put a pan there. Then they had to climb back up when the thing was full, and that was their palm wine. And so her brother was a big guy. He was always had a lot of money to show off. But she was mad at him this time because he was eyeing his father's fourth wife, who was quite a young woman with great eyes, and the woman returned his advances. And she was mad at him because she was going to give him a good talking to, because he might be a fine palm wine merchant to everybody else, but he was just a kid that she had whacked on the bottom several times. And he should not be looking at his father's fourth wife as if he would already was in charge of her and could have her for his wife, which is a custom. The son takes the father's wives, and then they are his wives just like anybody else. And so anyway, she was going to give her husband a good talking to. I once tried to talk to somebody about the same subject. They said, "Oh, madam, I cannot give her food if I get nothing in return." And so I said, "Go and do your work. I cannot talk to you anymore." Anyway, that is a custom. And she was giving her brother a good talking to about trying to get his father's wife's attention before her father was dead. Well, but after that, she was, she got real discouraged. There was nothing to do. She'd go out into the field and help all the other women hoe, and she used this kind of hoe for their yam, but her heart wasn't in it, and she didn't really didn't care if their crops grew or not. She was still thinking about Okonkwo's farm, and she longed to go home, but she had to stay there. But there was a great loneliness in her at that time. She stayed there for several months, and 2 of those times, Okonkwo came to the village to see his son. But they just met as strangers. He visited the child. But in the meantime, while the child was growing, she didn't have scales to say he's gained so much weight or he's so inches tall. She took a string and tied beads on it, and when she ever tried to add a bead, you knew he was growing. And so she would send messages to Okonkwo, and Wyatt has so many beads on, and how many beads, so the father would know how the child was growing. They actually do that. So anyway, finally it was all over. She could leave and go back home. And there was no ceremony for her leaving. She just left with the child still on her shoulders. And when she got to the river that flowed at the foot of the hill on which Okonkwo's village sat, she sat there a moment in the cool of the evening to ease the trembling that had come to her knees. In only a few moments she would wade the river, walk up the path to Okonkwo's compound. She would unwind and rear from her back and place him in the earth of her father's hut. Tonight she would pound yam from her own pot and set a bowl of it before her man in Okonkwo, whose shadow had not darkened her hut for many, many moons. No other children came to her during that time, but the second mother who had come, her choosing, twice had to leave the compound because she had 2 children and she had to go to her father's village. But Ezemo did not complain. She had Okonkwo and she did not talk about that. Well, one morning in his 5th year, and the 5th season, they don't call it years, it's their seasons. They go by a season of the rainy season and the dry season, so that's how they think of it. And Wyatt was so ill, and so she ordered second wife, go and find Okonkwo. This child is ill. And they tried everything, and then she thought, who has put a curse on us? Who does not like us? Well, she remembered that she had chased a woman's goat out of their compound right too long ago, and the woman had been really upset, but surely she wouldn't just make the child sick because she had run the goat out. Anyway, Okonkwo comes, and so they get some herbs and they force it down him, and he does revive, and they think, oh, the spirit is gone, he's going to live. And so Okonkwo went out and caught 2 chickens to make a sacrifice for their great Thanksgiving that he was still there. The first years in Wyatt's life belonged to his mother. He stayed with her when she went to wash the clothes, when she pounded her yam. He stayed with her all the time. But when he was about 8 years old, 2 things came to him that changed that, and he drew away from his mother so that he was not entirely hers anymore. And that happens, as I told you, doesn't matter which continent you live on. One thing was that they started a school in his village, and little Wyatt was learning to read. And Okonkwo was so excited. His son was learning to read, but Ezemo, she distrusted that school. And after the child had gone, she went down to the river to wash her clothes, but she felt so lonely, and Wyatt was not with her, and she whacked out her clothes and put them out to dry. And anyway, she went by their yam patch, and there was Okonkwo, and he said, "First wife, why have you come? What is it?" And she said, oh, I don't know. I brought you some water to drink. So she gave him some water from the jug, and he said, he said, our son is in. He is learning book at this very moment. And anyway, she thought, well, so what? But anyway, Okonkwo was happy about it. And then one day, the child was able to scratch in the earth of their compound markings that he declared to be his name. His father just chuckled with delight, but Ezemo was not taken in. He was her son. What did it matter what the marks on the ground was, of which way they were pointing? "But it is my name, Mother," Okonkwo exclaimed, "and soon I'm going to rewrite the names of my father and my brothers." He paused and looked up at her face. "I shall learn to write the name of my mother." Well, and Wyatt was good as his word, and he wrote all the names of his little brothers and his father. And then one day he came to his mother and said, "Come." And so he led his mother to the door of her hut, and there he stopped and pointed to the ground. "There is the name of my mother." Esmond studied each marking carefully, and a strange sense of excitement began welling in her. Here she stood, Esmond, and there in the earth it declared her to be so. And her flesh became word, and dwelt outside her hut. So, Esmond's name didn't, when she walked, she was careful to walk around her name so she didn't mess it up. But then the rains came and washed her name away. And then she thought, when the rains returned, she said, the word is gone. Now I have no name at all. And then she thought of asking Wyatt to write it down again, but she's a little embarrassed to do that. And everybody might have laughed at her because nobody else was so impressed with their names, and their names had been washed away a long time ago. Well, Wyatt was growing bigger and bigger. He had had his first pair of pants made, and he now wore shorts. He didn't run around naked on the compound, and he just seemed an utter strange child. And then somebody came to the village and said, okay, Wyatt has learned so well, he's just doing, but now there's a bigger school down, it was 4 market weeks away. Now market week is 4 days usually, and so it would take them 4 days walking to get to that school. And she'd never been so far away. But they said, okay, he could go and the government would pay for his school. So anyway, and Uncle was also proud that his son was chosen. And all the village was so proud. One of their sons was going to go to this big school. On the day that Wyatt left for boarding school, the entire village walked with him down to the river. Drums throbbed, children banged on pans and calabash gourds like this one right here. Now this one has been decorated, but that's a calabash thing, and so without all the carvings on it, it would make quite a good drum for kids to play with. So they took him down to the river. The women had hoes on their shoulders, and they chanted as they danced down. And Wyatt, tall with his book on top of his head, marched in front of them down the hill to the river. When Wyatt and the schoolmaster left them on the banks of the river and began wading out into the shallow waters, Esmond stood stock still. No tears, no hugs, for Wyatt no longer lived on her back. After all the others had turned back to their village and yam patches, Esmond stood gazing up the trail on the other side of the river. And Wyatt became smaller and smaller until he was only a speck moving through the thin slice of a trail that slit the green jungle, swallowing him up. She gazed until the speck was gone. Not once did Wyatt look back. A fish splashing in the river caught Esmond's life and forced her to look downward, and she noticed her hoe. She picked it up, turned her feet toward the yam patch, and not once did she look back. For every time, there is a time.